This is Chapter 11, Performance and Breach in Sales Contracts. Seller has an obligation to transfer and deliver conforming goods, and the buyer's obligation in a contract for the sale of goods is to accept those goods if they're conforming and pay for them. The courts also impose a good faith standard when a contract is unclear about its terms. Let's look in detail at the seller's obligation. First, tender of delivery. A seller has a duty to notify the buyer that conforming goods are at the disposal of the buyer to take delivery. Notice that this is different than actual delivery. That tender of delivery needs to be at a reasonable place and time. Another obligation is delivery in a non-carrier contract case at the seller's place of business. And if it's via carrier, it depends on whether it's a shipment or a destination contract. In a shipment contract, a seller must put conforming goods in the carrier's hands, notify the buyer that the shipment has been made, and then provide relevant documents. In a destination contract, the seller agrees to deliver goods at a particular destination. Now, the perfect tender rule. A seller has a duty to ship or tender conforming goods, and if the goods fail to conform to the agreement in any way, the buyer has a right to accept that shipment anyway, reject the entire shipment, or accept the conforming part and reject the non-conforming part. You can take a look at case 11.1. Another exception is called cure. If the seller repairs, adjust, or replace non-conforming goods within the time for performance, that would be considered a cure, and the nature of the defect needs to be disclosed. So basically, this is an adjustment that's made when the seller has time before the time for performance is up. Another one would be a substitution of carriers. If it's agreed upon that the carrier is not practical, then there could be a reasonable substitution of that carrier, even if that's not a perfect tender. In installment contracts, it would only be a violation of the perfect tender rule if it substantially impairs the value of the installment. So for example, if one piece of plywood out of 100 of the first shipment of 12 were defective, that wouldn't necessarily allow the buyer to reject everything. Another one is called commercial impracticality, and it extends only to unforeseeable circumstances. So even though it's not impossible to perform, it would be commercially impractical. And the example of that is case 11.2, where the court said that the increase in the price of milk was actually foreseeable, and that should have been addressed in the sales contract. Or partial performance. If there's already been partial performance, then the seller is obligated to secure the remaining performance via a third party. Or destruction of identified goods. The parties are excused only if the goods were identified at the time the contract was formed. And then assurance and cooperation. If the party makes an assurance, the other party has a duty, a good faith duty, to cooperate. Obligations of the buyer to pay. They have a right to inspect, and that can be an issue in even COD shipments. However, a buyer would still later have a right to inspect that shipment. Acceptance. They have a responsibility to accept conforming goods, either expressly by their words, in writing, by their conduct. And acceptance is presumed if the buyer had an opportunity to inspect and failed to reject the goods. Or even partial acceptance. A buyer doesn't have to accept less than a single commercial unit. There's also the concept of anticipatory repudiation, which means you anticipate there's going to be a breach. So if prior to performance one of the parties feels that there might be a breach, they can communicate to the other side their intention not to perform, or the non-breaching party could treat that as a repudiation. That's a final breach, and pursue remedies, or wait to see if the repudiating party honors the contract. In either case, the non-breaching party can suspend their own performance. So in other words, If you think the other party is going to breach, ask them, and if they say they will not be able to perform, you can treat that as a breach, even though the time for performance hasn't come. And the big thing about that is allowing you to suspend your own performance. You wouldn't want to pay for something that you anticipate that you're not really going to get. Remedies of the seller. They differ depending on where the goods are. When the goods are in possession of the seller and a buyer breaches, the seller would have a right to do these things: cancel the contract, withhold delivery, resell or dispose of goods, recover the purchase price, and recover damages. So you see all these remedies will differ depending on where the goods are at. In this case, it's easy to hold with delivery if you still have the goods. When the goods are not in the seller's hands now, they're in transit. If they can, they could stop the carrier and cancel the contract, resell the goods, sue to recover the deficiency, damages. They need to let the carrier know in a timely manner, and this right would continue until the buyer actually gets possession of the goods, or in other situations that are listed in the UCC. When the seller refuses to deliver the goods, a buyer would have the right to cancel the contract, get the goods they paid for, sue for specific performance to get them to perform under the contract, to cover, go get the goods from someone else, to replevy the goods, go get the actual goods, and recover damages, which is often the difference between what they were going to pay for them and what they would have to pay from a third party. When the seller delivers non-conforming goods, the buyer has a right to reject them, to revoke their acceptance. For example, if it was a large shipment of eggs, they couldn't expect all the eggs. When they discover that there is a non-conforming shipment, then they could revoke that acceptance, or recover damage for accepted goods. They keep the goods and then sue for the damages for the difference between what they got and what they should have gotten. There is the ability under the UCC for remedies, and also for the parties to limit their remedies. They could limit them to what they expressly agree to it, or even remedies beyond what the UCC. Or they could say that this is the exclusive remedy, whatever they agree to. They could limit consequential damages. And then there's the whole limitation in terms of a statute of limitations. If there's a breach of contract and the party waits too long, under the UCC, it's 4 years after the breach, then they wouldn't be able to bring a cause of action.